Good to be here with you. Thank you for coming out this morning. I want to start out with a little scenario. It's Sunday night. You are sitting at the dinner table, and you've just finished eating. And it's one of those rare Sunday nights where you have nothing on the schedule after dinner. There is no homework to finish up, no work that you need to do. There is nothing, no responsibilities whatsoever that you've got to take care of. And so what you've decided is you're going to just spend the rest of the evening settled on the couch, maybe watching some Netflix, watching some Sunday night football. If you're Pastor Schlee, maybe you're finishing up a puzzle. Whatever it is that you enjoy doing, that's what you want to do for the rest of your night. The problem is that you know that over there is a sink full of dishes that needs to get done before the night is out. My question for you is, are you going to do those dishes immediately after dinner and then relax the rest of the night? Or are you more of an option B type of person? Are you going to have the fun now and do the dishes later? Raise your hands if you're more of that option A person. You're going to do those dishes immediately after dinner. Okay. Raise your hand if you are an option B person. You want to have fun now and put the responsibilities off till later. Okay. Raise your hand if you're married to someone who chose the wrong option. Anybody? Yeah. Well, look, conversations, right? If you live with another person, whether you're living with a roommate or you're living with a spouse, conversations over things like when the dishes should get done can lead to some divisiveness. And I'm not going to say which side in the dish debate is correct because I'm not going to start any family arguments when it's icy outside, all right? I'm watching out for your safety today. But once you live with someone else, sooner or later, you find out that they have different habits and different rhythms than you do. And sometimes adjusting to those different habits and rhythms can be difficult, right? And the thing about our different habits and our rhythms is that by their very nature, our habits and rhythms become so ingrained into our lifestyle that many times we do them without even thinking about it, right? Or we don't intentionally do some of the things that we do, they're just our habits. And we're not always sitting down and making habits by, I'm going to sit here and decide what is the best way of doing this thing. Sometimes we create a habit simply because of the way we were raised and the way we've always done something. And so habits just simply become part of our life through repeating the same thing over and over again for a long time. And so for me, right, as a single guy who lived on his own for 10 years, I developed certain habits and rhythms during that period of my life. And when I got married, my wife got to discover some of those habits and rhythms. But the good news is, because I'm a church worker, all of my habits were perfect, so I didn't have to change my lifestyle at all when I got married. Now, you guys know better than that, right? Now, when you get married, you discover each other's habits, and sometimes you learn that just because you've always done one thing a particular way doesn't mean that that way is the best way. It was the same with Jess and I, right? We got married, and we got to witness each other's habits, and I discovered that I brought in some good and healthy habits into our marriage, and I brought in some not so good habits into our marriage, but that's just part of being human. We all have bad habits and bad rhythms. And sometimes the cost of those bad habits is a knowing laugh from your spouse because for the 25th night in a row, you forgot to close the bedroom door before getting into bed. Other times, the cost of bad habits, though, can be a little more serious. And my eyes last year were opened, really, to what the cost of bad habits can be. I got to watch this documentary on Netflix that Pastor Jim actually mentioned last week. It's called Live to 100. Bit of a cheesy title, but it's a great documentary. And the foundation of this documentary was built largely on trying to figure out why, for the first time in the past 100 years, American life expectancy is declining. And in fact, the statistics are even more extreme for men because there's now this huge age gap where American men are dying on average 6 years before American women. And as an American man, that statistic worries me. And so this documentary sought to figure out what are some of the habits and rhythms that are in our lives that might be contributing to this decline in life expectancy. And as I'm reading these statistics, I'm thinking about other statistics. I'm thinking about the rise in chronic stress that I've been reading about since college. And how chronic stress doesn't just take a mental toll on you, it takes a physical toll as well. Chronic stress has the capacity to take years off of your life. I'm thinking about statistics that I read about teenage suicide rates and how in the 90s and 2000s, when I was growing up, the suicide rate among 13 and 14-year-olds was on the decline, but now for the past 10 years, that number has doubled. That statistic concerns me. In fact, suicide rates across all age groups have been on the incline, on the increase for years now. I could go on and on with these statistics, but I think you guys already know the story that these statistics tell. Increasing stress, increasing suicide rates, declining life expectancy. There's something off about our lifestyle. And we know it, right? I think we know it. We have heard the research. We've been to the high school assemblies. We've heard the news stories. We've got the information. But I think the problem is that a lot of us might feel like, yes, I know there's something off about the way we're living. I know I've got some bad habits and bad rhythms I need to take care of, but what do I change my habits and rhythms to? Because every influencer and every prosperity gospel salesman out there is telling me that they've got the answer of how to fix my life, and it usually involves me giving them some kind of money. And so I'm a little bit suspicious when someone wants to tell me that they've got the answers to fix all of my bad habits. I don't have for you today the one-stop shop solution that's going to fix all of your life's problems. That is not responsible of me to do. But what I can do is point you to the fact that in the middle of all of this negative research, I found a bright spot. And it was a bright spot in God's church of all places. And it reminded me that the story of these statistics does not need to be our story, and it doesn't need to be our children's story. So let me tell you about this bright spot. There's this Protestant denomination out there called the Seventh-day Adventists. And they've been studied by scientists and researchers now for decades, right? You can find research from the 2010s going all the way back to the 60s. And what this research has shown is that this one group of Christians has somehow been outliving the rest of us on average from 5 all the way up to 10 years. Now, I hear that number. And my cynical, suspicious side might think, okay, well, why are they outliving us? Maybe they're richer than us. Maybe they've just got a lot of money in the Seventh-day Adventist church. And they've got better access to health care, whatever it might be. Well, it turns out that according to research done on the average income of the top 26 religious groups in America, Seventh-day Adventists come in at 20th. Coming below average, below the Episcopalians, below the Presbyterians, below atheists, and yes, below even LCMS Lutherans. So it's not a money thing. The Seventh-day Adventists are also the most diverse religious body in the United States either. And so their longevity has nothing to do with anything ethnic or demographic, right? It's not like Seventh-day Adventists are all Irish and we all of a sudden need to start eating more shepherd's pie or something like that, okay? And so I'm looking at this, and so I'm wondering, how is this religious body with below average wealth and diverse demographics, how are they outliving the rest of us by almost a decade? Well, besides having some strict dietary practices, the Seventh-day Adventists are known for faithfully following the weekly Sabbath. The weekly Sabbath that you might remember from the Ten Commandments. And throughout my research, everyone from the Huffington Post to university medical literature to this Netflix documentary, all of them were pointing to the practice of Sabbath as a major contributing reason of why these people were living longer than the rest of us. And you know what? When the press and science and Netflix are all pointing to the goodness of something in God's word, I think that means the church should pay attention. We're talking about the Sabbath today. And yet, other than being one of the 10 commandments and being a part of my childhood confirmation curriculum, we didn't really talk about the Sabbath growing up. If you're familiar with the 10 commandments, you might be familiar with this passage from Exodus chapter 20. It goes like this: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And for me, growing up, this verse essentially meant one thing. It meant go to church. And I thought that as long as I tucked in my shirt to look nice and I showed up to 8:30 worship, that I was remembering the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. The problem is that remembering the Sabbath day can't just mean go to church. Because this commandment was given to a roving band of Israelites who were wandering through the Sinai desert for 40 years, and there were no churches in the Sinai desert back during the Exodus. Now you might think, well, what about the tabernacle, right? There was this tabernacle I maybe remember hearing about, and a temple. Aren't those kind of like a church? And that's true, right? The Israelites did build a tabernacle, and they built a temple. But the thing is, there's only one tabernacle, only one temple. And once they settled the promised land, if you weren't living within walking distance of that temple, there was no structure for you to show up to for this weekly worship service that we might be thinking of. Later on during Jesus' ministry, we see him showing up to a weekly Sabbath worship or a weekly synagogue worship. And yes, those local synagogues did kind of look like a church, but those synagogues didn't come about until over 1,000 years after the Exodus. And so what we see here is that before there was a church, before there were synagogues, before there was a temple, there was Sabbath. So what was Sabbath? The word Sabbath is actually a Hebrew word that when properly pronounced is pronounced Shabbat, but if you don't want to sound like a nerd, we're just going to call it Sabbath. But that word Sabbath, it doesn't actually translate to mean church. It doesn't translate to mean worship. The word Sabbath simply translates to mean rest or to stop. And so when we read this commandment, honor, remember the Sabbath day, what we're reading is remember the rest day. Remember the stop working day. At the core of Sabbath is rest. At the core of the commandment is the command to stop working and rest. Now, I think a lot of us hear that commandment and think, man, rest sounds nice. Does anyone here think rest sounds very nice? I'm going to guess it does sound great to you. The problem is I would love to rest, but I'm just too busy, right? Honoring the Sabbath day, spending a whole day in Sabbath sounds wonderful, but my life's just too full. I get it. I am a 21st century millennial. I have been born and bred in this kind of a culture, okay? I understand. But I think we need to recognize that remembering the Sabbath is actually about more than just honoring a commandment. Because Sabbath, long before Scripture speaks about Sabbath as a commandment, we hear about Sabbath being a part of God's very order of creation. It was something that God wired into the way He made this world, this practice of Sabbath. In Genesis 2, after the creation of the world and the whole universe, we read this. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work He had been doing. So on the seventh day, He rested from all His work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done. I want you to think about the implications of this passage. God rested. Yeah, rest sounds nice, but I've got a very important job and this promotion I'm trying to get, so I can't let my foot off the gas at all right now. Sabbath sounds like a great practice, but you see, my kid needs to get into a good college, and they need to fill their life and schedule with as many things as possible to build up a resume and set themselves apart. So no Sabbath for me. Yeah, Sabbath and rest sounds wonderful, but I've got this side hustle I'm chasing right now, and I watch these YouTube gurus that tell me I got to grind 90 hours a week. God rested. God rested. And while the rhythms and the values of our culture might say that rest is something secondary, that it's some kind of a sign of weakness or a sign of laziness, God says, I created Sabbath rest, I commanded it, and it was so good I practiced it myself. Living apart from the weekly Sabbath means living apart from who God is and from the way God made us and formed us. And if we're tempted to think that God's way is incompatible with the modern world, I'm going to point you to one more piece of research. A study was done on people's working hours to check up on productivity. And what this research showed was that there was zero difference in productivity between a person working 70 hours a week and a person working 55 hours a week. 15 extra hours of work a week with absolutely nothing to show for it. And by the way, fun fact, 50 to 55 hours a week adds up to about 6 9-hour days of work, which leaves 1 day left for rest. The rhythm of busyness and hurry in our culture doesn't even give us the results that we want. It will always fall short of God's way. But living in the rhythm of the Sabbath means living in a rhythm that God blessed and God called holy. What do these two words mean, to be blessed and to be holy? If you were raised in a house like mine that watched Christmas Vacation every year, then the blessing was what Uncle Lewis told Aunt Bethany to do before Christmas dinner. But what actually is a real blessing? If you want to dig into what a Hebrew word means, you'd grab this gigantic volume called the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. That is not a flex at all, I'm telling you. But you'd grab this dictionary, and what it would tell you is that when God is the subject of a blessing, when God blesses something, it always speaks about an act that provides prosperity, abundance, and life. And so when God blesses Abraham, Abraham bears and has a son. When God blesses a field, that field produces in great abundance. And here in Genesis 2, God blesses a day, which means that in this day is this character of life-giving abundance that only comes from God. God blessed the Sabbath day, and he made it holy. What does holy mean? It's simply the word that refers to who God is. Holiness is God's attribute. That is the stuff of God, holiness. And God's presence makes things holy. And so the temple in Jerusalem is called holy because that's where God's Spirit lives. But before we get a holy temple, we get a holy day, a sanctuary in time where we meet the presence of God. God blessed the Sabbath day and he made it holy because on it he rested. What does this word rest mean? Well, God is God, so it's not like he's up there taking some kind of a nap, right? He's not getting his 8 hours in when he's resting. So what does it mean for God to rest? It simply means that this is the moment of his delight. That after 6 days of work, God kicks his feet up, sits back, and looks out on all the good things that he's made and simply enjoys it. That's what it means for God to rest. The Sabbath is about so much more than a church service. It is a day of rest where we find the life-giving abundance of God's blessing. It's a day of delight where we sit side by side with God and kick our feet up and look out at all the amazing and good things he has given and made for us. That is what the Sabbath day is all about. a day of delight and a day of rest. Between Genesis 2 and Jesus' lifetime, God's people twisted the meaning of this day to turn it from this day of rest and delight and into a day of rule following and restrictions. Thankfully, when Jesus came down, he clarified and made sure we knew what the Sabbath was all about. Here's a story from the book of Mark. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick up some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." From the words of Jesus himself, the Sabbath was made for you, for your benefit, for your good. The Sabbath was made to meet your needs. And for us in 2024 who follow Jesus, while the world might be following the lords of hurry and the lords of consumerism, we follow the Lord of rest and delight. That's the character of the God we follow. John Mark Comer, the author of the Ruthless, Elimination of Hurry, which this series is based on, he describes Sabbath as having Christmas Day every single week without the weird uncles around. That sounds like a great day to me. Dan Allender is another author who wrote a book on the Sabbath, and he describes it like this. The Sabbath is an invitation to enter delight. The Sabbath, when experienced as God intended, is the best day of our lives. Without question or thought, it is the best day of the week. It is the day we anticipate on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and the day we remember on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Sabbath is the holy time where we feast, play, dance, have sex, sing, pray, laugh, tell stories, read, paint, walk, and watch creation in its fullness. Few people are willing to enter Sabbath because a full day of delight and joy is more than most people can bear in a lifetime, let alone a week. Tell me that you don't want a day like that in your life. Tell me that you don't need a day like that in your life. Our marriages, which are built upon vows of delighting in one another and being in one another's presence, need a day like this. And our kids that are modeling and viewing their lives after our own are going to see what we do, and they need to be a part of a day like this. With a day like that, it is no wonder why these Seventh-day Adventists are outliving us by almost a decade. Throughout the writing of this sermon, my wife kept bringing up to me this verse from 1 John. It says, "The commands of the Lord are not burdensome." And isn't that true about the Sabbath? That yes, this is a command, but it is not a burden. Jesus, when he talks about his commands and his ways, speaks about it like this. He says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." I kept thinking through planning this message, how amazing it would be if at Messiah, the Sabbath day become a day of Sabbath once again. One day out of the week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, whatever works for your family and your schedule, but a day where we set aside the work and the homework and the rushing to practice and the endless hurry that sucks out from our life what God wants to give to our life. It's this God-designed Sabbath day, this day designed for us that our homes need. And I would say it's a day like this that our neighbors need as well. When you go back to the Sabbath in the Ten Commandments, I want to look at that. And that verse I shared from you earlier, that's actually only one part of that commandment on Sabbath. The rest of the commandment on Sabbath goes like this. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This verse can give us some guidelines and what it looks like to Sabbath. First, we see that this is a day that's for us and it's for our families, it's for our animals and the rest of God's creation, and we see that it is for the foreigner living in your midst, which means that God had an intention for the Sabbath that went beyond just his own people. It was meant to bless not just the people of Israel, but their neighbors and those living among them as well. There was an outreach component to the practice of Sabbath. It was a habit that was meant not just for the benefit of his people. It had a benefit that was meant for the whole community, believer and non-believer alike. And this isn't the only place that we see faithful rhythms meant to bless our community, meant for the goodness of our neighbors. There's this professor named Dr. Alan Kreider, and he's an early church historian, and what he did is he went to seek out why was it that the early church grew in the Roman Empire in a world that was so hostile to the Christian way, in a world that saw them as social outcasts. And what he found out was that the early church didn't grow rapidly because of well-funded evangelism campaigns. It didn't grow because of big attractional events. The early church grew because of one simple thing, because of the habits and the good habits of everyday Christians. He describes the growth of the church like this. He says, it was the Christians' habits, their reflexes and their way of life that suggested that there was another way to perceive reality. That made the Christians interesting, challenging, and worth investigating. There's another early church writer that said this. He said, as for the daily increase in the church, as for the daily increase in our numbers, it's the beauty of the Christian life that encourages its followers to persevere and the strangers to join our ranks. What the early church wants us to know is that if we want to raise the next generation with a faith that perseveres, a faith that lasts through their life, they don't need big flashy events. They need the life-giving, transformative power of the way of Jesus. And our neighbors aren't looking for a well-funded campaign of advertising from the church. They are looking for the life-giving habits of practices like Sabbath. Our kids, our neighbors, and we need the good things that we find in the Sabbath day. So yes, practicing Sabbath is countercultural. But I would say it is the countercultural practice that our culture so desperately needs. And if our neighbors are exhausted and worn out and run dry, if our kids are exhausted and worn out and run dry from chasing the gods of consumerism and hurry, then maybe we need to show them the God of rest and delight. And if you feel exhausted and worn out by chasing those same gods of consumerism and hurry, I want to tell you today, we worship the God of rest and delight. So how do you practice Sabbath? How do you practice this life-giving gift that God's given us? If you look at the life of Jesus, you get a few examples. We know it was a day where he didn't work, a day where he rested. We also know that it's a day where he attended local synagogue worship. Yes, I was saying earlier, Sabbath is about more than worship, but worship was an integral part of the Sabbath practice. So a day of rest, a day of worship, and a day of eating a meal with his friends and with his neighbors. And so if I could give you 5 guidelines on what it looks like to practice the Sabbath, here's some words I think you should aim for. It should be a day of worship. It should be a day of rest. In parentheses, not working. It should be a day of feasting, a day of delight, and a day of community, and a day of enjoying God's creation. If you have a Sabbath day that looks like this, you will enter that blessed and holy place that God talks about. John Mark Comer, though, he puts Sabbath practice a lot more simple. He says, to Sabbath means simply to worship and to rest. Within Sabbath, we find the character of our God. The God who says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy with burdens, and I will give you rest. And for us, because of the cross, that promise is not just words we get to read. It's a promise we get to experience in the life to come, and a promise we get to experience here in this life now. Sabbath is a day tailor-made by God to give his children a weekly reminder that I have done all things for you and I will provide all things for you. And so to that I say, all praise and all glory and all honor be to the Lord of the Sabbath. Amen.